Imagine this. You're engaged in a conversation, surrounded by individuals immersed in trivial matters, the latest gossip, superficial news, or a repetitive topic that leads nowhere. You attempt to contribute, aiming to introduce a deeper perspective, a more insightful analysis. But you're met with blank stares, abrupt shifts in the conversation, or worse, the nagging feeling that your point was completely missed. Then arises that inevitable conclusion. Perhaps it's best to remain silent. If this scenario resonates with you, you're far from alone. However, the issue isn't your inadequacy. The crux of the matter lies in the fact that profound intelligence doesn't necessarily foster connection. It can, paradoxically, create separation. The more you comprehend the intricate nature of the world, the more challenging it becomes to discover someone who shares your insights. And make no mistake, this intellectual solitude isn't merely a figment of your imagination. Society subtly marginalizes those who dare to think outside the conventional box. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of history's most brutally honest philosophers, believed that exceptional intelligence isn't a gift, but rather a burden, a weight that isolates those who see beyond the facade of everyday existence. According to him, the more acutely you perceive the inherent contradictions of the world, the more frustrating it becomes to articulate them to those who dwell on the surface. After all, the vast majority of people aren't seeking truth. They crave comfort and reassurance. And so, the question arises, if intelligence inherently leads to isolation, what is the path forward? How can one navigate a world where it seems as though no one shares your cognitive landscape? If you've ever experienced this profound disconnect, this emptiness stemming from the absence of genuine intellectual exchange, then this exploration is designed for you. Perhaps the root of the problem isn't your loneliness itself, but rather what it reveals about the world that surrounds you. Is intelligence a gift or a curse? In theory, it would seem self-evident that heightened intelligence should simplify life. You grasp concepts more swiftly, identify patterns that elude others, and sidestep errors that most people commit. Yet, in practice, that very intelligence, which should be advantageous, can morph into an invisible barrier that isolates you from the collective. Arthur Schopenhauer grasped this reality with exceptional clarity. For him, extraordinary intelligence condemns an individual to loneliness because the majority simply lack the desire to engage in deep thought. This isn't necessarily due to an inherent inability, but rather because there's often no immediate social benefit derived from such intellectual pursuits. Why delve into complex philosophical inquiries, challenge deeply ingrained dogmas, and expose the hypocrisy that pervades institutions when such endeavors only lead to discomfort and dissonance? For most, life becomes easier when they embrace the world as it is presented, without raising difficult questions. But for some, the mind is incessantly active, constantly analyzing, always perceiving subtleties that others overlook. You discern when people deceive themselves, when they cling to illusions simply because facing reality is too daunting. You feel the frustration of attempting to explain something, only to realize that no one is truly listening. Not because they disagree, but because your words disrupt the comfortable narrative they've painstakingly constructed. And that is precisely the crucial point. Society doesn't prioritize truth. It prioritizes conformity. There's an unseen structure that maintains equilibrium, and this structure relies on individuals believing in particular illusions. that happiness resides in material possessions, that success entails adhering to a predetermined path, that common sense is invariably correct. Those who challenge these fundamental premises become disruptive, a dissonant element within the established order. This elucidates why, throughout history, pioneering thinkers have often been initially rejected before ultimately achieving recognition. Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth simply because he posed questions that exposed the ignorance of those in power. Galileo was persecuted for asserting the self-evident truth that the earth revolves around the sun. Nietzsche was ridiculed and deemed insane for challenging the very foundations of Christian morality. Nikola Tesla died in relative obscurity, while others profited immensely from his groundbreaking inventions. Would it be any different in the present day? Technology has undoubtedly advanced, but human nature, in its essence, remains largely unchanged. We still inhabit a society that punishes those who dare to think differently. Rejection may not be as overtly violent as during the era of the Inquisition, but it persists in subtle, insidious forms. It manifests as social isolation, the feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood, the difficulty in finding kindred spirits who truly share your worldview. And this leads us to the central question: does the problem lie within intelligence itself or within the world around us? Perhaps the genuine reason for the isolation experienced by the most intelligent individuals isn't a deficiency in social skills, but rather the disconcerting fact that, for many, truth is inherently uncomfortable. What you perceive with clarity, others actively choose to ignore. And this willful blindness, this deliberate refusal to look beyond the superficial, is what erects the formidable barrier between you and the rest of the world. If society harbors one overriding fear, it's undoubtedly the presence of someone who thinks independently. The majority adhere to an invisible script, repeating pre-packaged ideas without ever subjecting them to critical scrutiny. And that, ultimately, is the underlying reason why intelligence doesn't necessarily bring people closer. In many cases, it actively drives them away. Consider this. When you encounter someone physically stronger than yourself, you may experience admiration. Upon seeing someone wealthier, you might feel envy, but rarely hostility. However, when you demonstrate intellectual superiority, the reaction is seldom one of admiration or envy. More often, it's one of resistance and defensiveness. While strength and wealth are external advantages, intelligence exposes something far more sensitive: the perceived limitations of others. The mere presence of a deep thinker forces individuals to confront their own cognitive shortcomings, and this is a confrontation that no one readily welcomes. Intelligence functions as a mirror, reflecting back what others desperately try to avoid seeing: how limited their beliefs may be, how superficial their conversations have become, how entrenched they are in a cycle of distraction and conformity. And how does a human being typically respond when confronted with discomfort? They either attack or they choose to ignore the source of that discomfort. This explains why the independent thinker has consistently been perceived as a threat. Schopenhauer understood that society not only rejects those who question its fundamental structures, but also actively punishes them. He posited that the further someone distances themselves from mediocrity, the more solitary they become, because the majority of people simply lack the desire to confront reality in all its complexities. In a world that places a premium on convenience and ease, The truth is simply too heavy a burden to bear. And this rejection doesn't solely manifest on an intellectual plane. It permeates everyday life, revealing itself in subtle nuances. You make an insightful observation, and people avert their gaze. You introduce a novel perspective, and someone abruptly changes the subject. You perceive patterns that no one seems willing to acknowledge, and you're subsequently labeled as negative or overly complicated. It's a subtle yet relentless process, a gradual distancing that pushes you to the margins, simply because you see what others actively strive to ignore. But this rejection doesn't signify that you're wrong. Quite the contrary, it suggests that you're seeing beyond the carefully constructed smokescreen that keeps most people trapped within their comfortable illusions. And that's why intelligence so often leads to isolation. Not because intelligent individuals deliberately choose to be alone, but because the world, in its inherent nature, prefers to push them away. If you've ever felt isolated because of your particular way of thinking, you may have come to realize that this loneliness isn't always imposed by external forces. Often it's a choice you consciously make for yourself. Initially, there's a genuine effort to connect with others, to share your ideas, to find someone who perceives the world through a similar lens. But over time, as these interactions become increasingly frustrating, empty, or simply emotionally exhausting, an inescapable conclusion begins to take hold. Perhaps it's simply better to be alone. Schopenhauer believed that intelligent individuals often gravitate toward solitude, not out of disdain for society, but out of sheer necessity. He argued that, for those who think deeply, the world often appears as a superficial spectacle, a grand theater, where most participants pretend to comprehend things they've never truly questioned. Attempting to actively participate in this elaborate charade requires an immense expenditure of mental energy, and ultimately, the rewards are negligible. The price of socialization often amounts to the frustration of engaging in conversations devoid of substance, of interactions where one must artificially diminish one's own intellect simply to be understood. And that's when the gradual distancing inevitably begins. First, you start avoiding certain social circles because you sense that your ideas aren't welcome. Then, you begin to more carefully curate your interactions, seeking out conversations that possess some genuine meaning and depth. And finally, you come to the realization that the most rewarding company is often your own mind. Not because you harbor disdain for others, but because they seem to offer nothing beyond fleeting distractions and superficial pleasantries. But here lies the insidious trap. This isolation, which initially seems like a refuge, can swiftly transform into a psychological prison. The mind of a deep thinker never truly rests. It's perpetually engaged in spinning, analyzing, and questioning. And without someone to exchange ideas with, without opportunities for intellectual challenges, thought can devolve into a closed loop where everything makes perfect sense only within the confines of your own carefully constructed perspective. Intelligence can effectively distance you from ignorance, but it can also inadvertently trap you within your own bubble of understanding. And that's where loneliness transcends mere isolation and transforms into something far deeper. A kind of psychological exile where, even when surrounded by other people, you still feel profoundly disconnected and alienated. You may even engage in interactions, laugh, and converse about trivial matters, but deep down, you recognize that something essential is missing: a genuine dialogue, a true and meaningful exchange of ideas. The great tragedy of self-imposed isolation lies in the fact that it's not a choice in the conventional sense. No one truly desires to be completely alone, but when the world only offers superficiality, when connections become a burden rather than a source of joy, loneliness seems like the only logical path. And that's the central irony. The more deeply you comprehend the world, the less of a place there seems to be for you within it. If intelligence is inherently valuable, why does society so consistently reject it? Why are those who see beyond the surface so often ridiculed, ignored, or even actively attacked? The answer is remarkably simple. The world wasn't designed for deep thinkers. It was designed for conformists. Since its very inception, society has invariably favored those who adhere to the established rules, not those who dare to challenge them. From the moment we enter the education system, we're trained to obey, not to think critically. We learn to passively memorize information without questioning its validity, to accept pre-packaged truths without conducting our own independent investigations. The student who asks too many probing questions is invariably viewed as disruptive and bothersome. The employee who suggests innovative changes is perceived as a threat to the stability of the company. The citizen who challenges the dominant narrative is branded as a troublemaker. Schopenhauer recognized this dynamic with exceptional clarity. He believed that the world was dominated by a pervasive system of collective mediocrity, where independent thought was viewed as a dangerous and destabilizing force. He argued that most people don't genuinely seek the truth. They crave comfort and reassurance, and the truth is rarely comfortable. This explains why the great thinkers in history were so often rejected and ostracized before ultimately achieving recognition. Socrates was condemned to death for challenging the established values of Athenian society. Galileo was persecuted for suggesting that the earth wasn't the center of the universe. Nietzsche was deemed insane for exposing the inherent contradictions within Christian morality. And even in contemporary society, revolutionary thinkers are often discredited and marginalized before their ideas eventually gain widespread acceptance. But this resistance to intelligence isn't limited to the prominent figures in philosophy and science. It manifests every day in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. It occurs when you attempt to engage in a meaningful conversation, and people avert their gaze, impatiently waiting for you to finish. When you suggest a different perspective and are immediately dismissed. When you perceive patterns that others choose to ignore, and instead of curiosity, you're met with indifference and hostility. The truth is that society not only fails to value critical thinking, it actively discourages it, because individuals who think too deeply are inherently more difficult to control. They don't readily accept pre-packaged narratives. They aren't satisfied with simplistic answers. And this poses a direct threat to a system that relies on widespread conformity to maintain its functionality. And here lies the ultimate paradox. Society undeniably needs deep thinkers to evolve and progress, but at the same time, it actively rejects them. It desires the benefits of intelligence, technological advancements, scientific breakthroughs, philosophical innovations, but it doesn't want to contend with the discomfort that deep thinking invariably brings. That's why those who see beyond the superficial will always remain a minority. A lonely minority, perhaps, but an essential minority nonetheless. Exceptional intelligence not only isolates, it can also be a heavy and unrelenting burden to bear. It's not just society's rejection that inflicts pain, but also the very impact of profound understanding on the mind itself. Schopenhauer understood this with brutal honesty. The more one understands the true nature of reality, the more difficult it becomes to derive pleasure from it. The majority of people live within the protective confines of comforting illusions. They believe that life possesses inherent meaning, that justice invariably prevails, that hard work is always rewarded. They subscribe to concepts such as destiny, luck, and merit. These beliefs provide motivation, instill purpose, and enable individuals to continue moving forward even in the face of adversity. But a deep thinker, someone who genuinely questions these fundamental premises, inevitably arrives at an unsettling conclusion. None of these beliefs are guaranteed, and this represents the fundamental divergence between the average person and the deep thinker. The average person possesses the capacity to deceive themselves, and this self-deception sustains their happiness. The deep thinker, on the other hand, perceives the world as it truly exists, chaotic, indifferent, and rife with contradictions. They come to realize that morality isn't absolute, but rather a socially constructed concept, that the relentless pursuit of happiness is often nothing more than a futile race after desires that have been carefully programmed by culture, that the majority of people aren't genuinely seeking truth, but rather validation for their pre-existing beliefs. And this is where intelligence transforms into a crushing weight, because once you've truly seen, you can never unsee. You can't simply turn off your mind and pretend that everything is perfectly logical and coherent. You can't revert to a state of comfortable ignorance. As Nietzsche famously wrote, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." This is the inherent price of profound understanding, a widening chasm of disconnection from the world around you. While others celebrate minor triumphs, a new car, a promotion at work, a fleeting romantic encounter, the deep thinker silently wonders, does any of this really matter in the grand scheme of things? What seems profoundly satisfying to the majority appears superficial and ultimately meaningless to them. And this pervasive feeling of displacement gradually intensifies until they feel like an outsider, a stranger in their own time. It's hardly surprising that many of history's greatest thinkers have experienced periods of profound melancholy and even debilitating depression. Pascal described the infinite silence of the universe as something inherently terrifying. Kierkegaard spoke of the existential anguish of being an isolated individual. Kafka transformed the feeling of alienation into a powerful literary form. Schopenhauer, perhaps the most pessimistic of all, viewed life as an unending cycle of desires and frustrations, where the only true escape lay in complete renunciation. But here lies the crucial question. If intelligence condemns us to see the truth without the benefit of comforting illusions, how can we possibly live without being utterly consumed by it? Is there a viable path that lies somewhere between comfortable ignorance and absolute despair? This is the question that ultimately separates those who merely suffer from their intelligence from those who learn to effectively harness its power. And the answer may lie precisely in the full acceptance of one's own solitude. If intelligence leads to isolation, and a profound understanding of the world can become a burdensome weight, what recourse remains? What can someone who sees beyond the surface do to avoid being consumed by their own mind? Schopenhauer believed that the only way for a deep thinker to attain any measure of inner peace was to fully embrace their solitude and redirect their energy towards something genuinely productive. He argued that intelligent individuals shouldn't waste their time and energy attempting to conform to a society that will likely never fully understand them. Instead, they should embrace solitude as a privilege, not as a form of punishment. But this isn't an easy answer to accept, because deep down, every human being harbors a fundamental desire for connection. Even the most intellectually independent individuals yearn to be understood, to find someone who shares their unique worldview, someone who can engage in true and meaningful dialogue. The problem is that these encounters are exceedingly rare, and expecting society as a whole to value the profundity of deep thought is likely a futile endeavor. So, what effective strategies can be implemented? The first crucial step is to fully understand that intellectual solitude doesn't necessarily equate to total isolation. There are numerous avenues for finding like-minded individuals, whether through engaging with profound literature, studying philosophy, participating in intellectual communities, or even appreciating works of art. Many of history's greatest thinkers lived relatively isolated lives, but their groundbreaking ideas transcended their own time because they were carefully recorded, rigorously discussed, and ultimately recognized for their profound significance. The second vital step is to consciously direct your intelligence towards something intrinsically meaningful. A mind that lacks meaningful challenges and a clear sense of purpose can quickly become a trap for itself. Engaging in creative endeavors, relentlessly exploring new ideas, and constantly learning and expanding your knowledge. All of these actions can transform the perceived burden of intelligence into a powerful and transformative tool. And lastly, fully accept the inherent reality that the world will invariably resist those who dare to think differently. Society rarely embraces its most revolutionary thinkers during their own lifetimes. Only later, when their once radical ideas are no longer perceived as a threat to the established order, do they finally become widely admired. This means that if you consistently feel like you don't quite fit in, you might actually be exactly where you should be. But now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced the feeling that your unique way of thinking isolates you, that the individuals around you simply can't keep pace with your perspective? Please share your personal experiences and reflections in the comments below. And don't stop here. If you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking, then the next discussion is absolutely essential. Click on the link and continue exploring, because this conversation is far from over. So, if this resonates with you, remember this: your profound intelligence, while sometimes feeling like a burden, is ultimately a gift. It's an invitation to delve deeper, to see more clearly, and to contribute meaningfully to a world that desperately needs innovative thought. The path to navigating this world, even with its imperfections, lies in self-acceptance, in finding purpose, and in connecting with those rare kindred spirits who resonate with your cognitive clarity. Maybe some of the strategies discussed here will even inspire new high-performance habits to help you navigate the path ahead. It's about finding that sweet spot between embracing solitude and seeking genuine connection, all while remembering that your unique perspective is valuable, even if it's not always immediately understood. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you grappled with the challenges of feeling intellectually isolated? What mental health tools have you found helpful in navigating these experiences? Share your stories, insights, or any questions you might have in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you're interested in more explorations of consciousness, the burdens and advantages of intelligence, and ways to find more conscious living in our ever-evolving world, be sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on future neuroscience content and other thought-provoking videos. Thanks for joining the discussion today.